Another vessel of the Russian Federation attacked by NATO, Russian citizens trying to be detained by Finland. In this case, with everything that's happening on the international stage, it seems that NATO hasn't learned a single thing from this election. Let's take a detailed look at what has happened, because they're now bothering the Russian Federation again. And above all, what consequences will this have at the international level? Stay until the end, because that's when I'm going to reveal it to you. What on earth do the Wagner have to do with this whole story? Because indeed, the aggression now seems to be carried out by the collective West. But the answer will definitely be in the hands of the Russian Federation, and it will be extremely tough. I'm telling you in advance, let's begin, period. The images of what happened speak for themselves. The Russian Federation is once again being attacked by NATO. The Finnish border guard released heroic images of the boarding and capture of the civilian vessel. Fidberg departed from St. Petersburg and has turned out to be suspicious for Finland of another alleged cutting of communication cables between Tallinn and Helsinki among the Catholics. Among the crew members were citizens of Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and also Kazakhstan. All of them were interrogated. So far, it is known that Finland has detained 2 crew members of the vessel, both of whom are citizens of the Russian Federation, as part of the investigation into the damage to the cable, and 2 others have been prohibited from leaving the country at this time until otherwise instructed. According to the latest information, the ship Fidberg was outside Finnish territorial waters at the time of the capture. Therefore, Finland's actions seriously violate international law and maritime law. They fall under the definition of piracy. And this is where we come to a precedent, which is once again set by NATO, attacking a country whose ships are even in international waters. We're not even talking about oil tankers now, but about an alleged cable cut, something that can't even be confirmed. That's something they can practically pull out of thin air. They can make it up at any moment. It sets a very powerful and dangerous precedent. From this point on, it seems like NATO believes it is right in any case and thinks it has the right to detain the Russian Federation and ships belonging to that country, as well as the crew who are also Russian nationals, to interrogate them and to hold them in the territory of any NATO country. In this case, we're talking about Finland. In other words, they're trying to get on Russia's back. They're trying to put pressure on Russia. And they still don't expect the response, but without a doubt, it will come. And it could come from several directions, the last of which I think will surprise more than one person, because it involves fighters from private military company Wagner. The thing is, all of this has gone smoothly for a key reason. Well, in particular, for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Russian Federation, for now, has not been carrying out any kind of symmetrical response to these types of attacks carried out by NATO. In mostly international waters, we've seen how Ukraine, not so long ago, it was attacking Russian ships one after another with its drones, absolutely civilian vessels, fighting against the Russian fleet. In the shadows, these were ships that weren't even sailing under the flag of the Russian Federation, which of course makes these actions even more serious and more dangerous. On the other hand, we have to mention the fact that if inspections become normalized from now on, this will be a definitive attempt by NATO to deter the Russian Federation. To travel at least through the Baltic Sea, which is one of the routes the country often uses, especially to transport goods, including oil. But it's really outrageous that, at this point, NATO has to be told for some reason, because of the sanctions. I don't know what the hell. Telling the Russian Federation what the heck it has to do with its oil, right? I mean, we're talking really about absolutely inconceivable things. Could the Russian Federation respond? Yes, but how? On one hand, yes, we're talking about the possibility of an asymmetric response. Here, absolutely anything could be possible. A response on Ukrainian territory, which is certainly very asymmetric. But we know that NATO is very sensitive to, for example, losing its personnel. That would be very effective. On the other hand, there are also these issues of sabotage within the territory of the North Atlantic Alliance countries. They could be strategic factories that, well, catch fire and no one really knows what happened there. Drones launched, supposedly from other sources like Russian ships, but in the vast majority of cases, this has not been confirmed so far. But could Russia actually do what it's being accused of, even if it hasn't done it yet? Well, yes, it could step up its efforts, but above all, the response from the Russian Federation in this case is quite symmetrical. It could include the Wagner private military company or the militants who are still part of that organization, in the sense that the Wagner private military company, let's remember, is a private military organization. Well, that was before the absolutely tragic events of June 24. Clearly, among other things, it is also dedicated to private security. The master's program leaders have top-level private security, primarily focused on training military personnel from each country. In Venezuela, it hasn't worked well, but I doubt that's the private military company's fault. Wagner focuses on training the bodyguards of presidents, and also on teaching these special military forces, these special forces, even how they should act. With high priority targets, ports, the most important stations, basically, of course, they also focus on escorting high priority targets. In this case, we could perfectly understand the most important ships or the ships of the Russian Federation. Simply put, since the fighters from private military company Wagner could, or those who are still left, I mean, unofficially, without private military company Wagner existing, now, as such, they could go aboard these ships of the Russian Federation, whether they are oil tankers or not, to effectively carry out the tasks of ensuring their security. Because I assure you of one thing, all these military personnel, all these special forces from Finland and other NATO countries are presenting themselves as so heroic. And they're showing off so much for a very simple reason. On these civilian ships of the Russian Federation, absolutely no one is armed, and therefore no one expects any kind of response to these actions. The most basic and blatant piracy that they are carrying out, moreover, in international waters, thus violating all existing and future laws. But imagine that on one of these ships belonging to the Russian Federation, by some chance, suddenly, for example, a guy with a machine gun appears. And what about the Finnish border guard? Well, not only does it have to deal with a civilian ship and its crew, but it also has to confront them. In addition, they have to deal with well-armed and well-prepared military personnel, or personal escorts, or private security. You can call it whatever you want, but I think the matter is absolutely clear and obvious. It seems that the Russian Federation can't do much, but in reality, the Russian Federation has so far been showing the patience that, in fact, usually characterizes that country. It hasn't been responding too much. And something happens that already happened with Ukraine, for example, when Ukraine was being a real pain for a long time by attacking. Well, a really long time in relative terms, but still. After the attack on several ships of the Russian Federation, oil tankers, a ship carrying oil, even with Ukrainian drones, it turns out that Ukraine wouldn't calm down, and wouldn't calm down, and wouldn't calm down until Russia started bombing the port of Odessa and all the surrounding areas, all the neighboring towns. When it turns out that Russia started targeting international ships, especially ships that were coming to Ukraine directly from Turkey. And judging by some of the explosions, by the nature of the explosions, they could have been carrying something more dangerous than grain, oil, or generators, which Ukraine needs so much right now because of this harsh winter that has also been officially imposed on them, because of the lack of willingness to negotiate from the Kiev regime, especially Volodymyr Zelensky. And then suddenly, Ukraine calmed down. And we haven't heard anything more about the recent, or not so recent, Ukrainian attacks against ships of the Russian Federation. It seems that NATO is asking for its own special pill. I highly doubt that the Russian Federation is going to carry out any aggression against any NATO country directly. But there are some very good indirect ways to respond. A machine gun on every civilian ship escorted by this private security, or it could be official security, meaning belonging to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. I think it could indeed be a pretty good cure for all the arrogance that NATO is showing right now. Do they really think they can commit any atrocity, act like pirates as many times as they want, and whenever they themselves think it's necessary against the Russian Federation? Indeed, like the good bear it is, it wakes up very lazily. But once the bear gets up, you better watch out for the response that might come, because it can be very, very unpleasant for the Atlantic Norwegian alliance.